Hello and welcome everyone for attending today's webinar, Export Compliance Essentials. Thank you for joining us. This is the latest in a series of free webinars we're hosting on topics related to exporting and importing. My name is Dave Noah and I'm president of Shipping Solutions, and I'll be your presenter today. If you haven't noticed, we are living in an interesting time to be involved in exporting and importing with all that's happening in the world right now, including a war in Ukraine and related export restrictions, new and potential U.S. tariffs on imports from several countries, and disruption within government agencies that administer how export and import regulations are conducted and enforced. It's important more now than ever that we make a concerted effort to monitor the situation with all these changes because, as we've noticed, they are sometimes happening very quickly and they could have a significant impact on your company's international business. Now, one of the ways you can stay on top of these changes is to make sure you take advantage of the free resources that we offer on the Shipping Solutions website, including our webinars like this one, our various white papers, and our Passages, the international trade blog. If you aren't already a subscriber to Passages, you can go to our website, shippingsolutions.com/blog, to subscribe. So you'll be notified whenever we publish new international trade articles or have new webinars on the calendar. We typically publish a new article every Tuesday and Thursday. Now, despite all these current disruptions, what I'm going to talk about today, Export Compliance Essentials, they're, as of now, right now anyway, remain fundamentally unchanged. So I'm going to walk you through the basic steps your company needs to follow to ensure compliance with U.S. export regulations. Export compliance regulations don't just apply to the big guys. Even the smallest U.S. exporters are subject to a variety of export regulations and can face substantial penalties for violating these rules. Unfortunately, for many small and medium-sized businesses, company personnel may not know these requirements until it's too late. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, fines for export violations can reach up to $1 million per violation in criminal cases, while administrative cases can result in a penalty amounting to the greater of $350,000 or twice the value of a transaction. In addition, criminal violators may be sentenced to prison for up to 20 years, and administrative penalties may include denial of export privileges. Now, penalties of this size and nature can be especially devastating to small and medium-sized businesses, which represent about 97% of the 300,000 or so U.S. companies that export. Small and medium-sized businesses may think they lack the time or money to train personnel in export regulations and the necessity of compliance screening. Even if they do have the necessary experience and training, export personnel may not have the support of senior management who are too often unaware of U.S. export regulations. If your senior management doesn't think you need to worry about export compliance, I recommend you download and share with them the BIS publication, Don't Let This Happen to You, which you can see here on the screen. This ebook outlines real-life examples of penalties BIS has recently issued against individuals and businesses who have violated export regulations, and it has been very recently updated. Companies that export or plan to start exporting need to follow these 7 steps to ensure they comply with export regulations. While these 7 steps are by no means all-inclusive, they give you a good starting point for implementing an export compliance program at your company. So, step number 1. Most exporters are familiar with the harmonized system or Schedule B codes used to classify products for duty and statistical purposes. However, exporters are often less familiar with the classification process required for export control purposes. This starts with determining which U.S. agency has jurisdiction over your products, and then identifying whether there is a classification number that may put restrictions on the export of your goods. The Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, also known as BIS, controls the export of most commercial products. Now, while only a small percentage of exports under BIS's jurisdiction require an export license, it's a product's technical characteristics, the destination country, the end user, and a product's end use that factor into that determination. But before you can assume that your products are controlled by BIS, you must make sure that they aren't controlled by the Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Control, or DDTC. These products controlled by DDTC may be described in the U.S. Munitions List, or USML, under a specific USML category, or they may be described in a catch-all paragraph that incorporates specially designed as a control parameter in the EAR. Now, the catch-all paragraph doesn't refer to a specific item, but instead controls non-specific items because they were specifically designed for a specific item. For example, ECCN paragraph 9A610.x is a catch-all because it controls parts, components, accessories, and attachments especially designed for military aircraft, but it doesn't specify what those items are. All items covered by the USML require an export license from the State Department. If your item is not covered anywhere in the USML, the Export Administration Regulations says that export control jurisdiction then transfers to the Department of Commerce. If you determine that an item is not subject to the USML, you can move on to check the Commerce Control List, or CCL, which is the list of export control classification numbers, which are known as ECCNs. These classification numbers are for dual-use items, meaning that they were designed for commercial use, but have the potential to be adapted for weapons or military-related use. Many seemingly harmless items may be considered dual-use, from valves and communication hardware to electrical devices and vehicle parts. ECCNs are 5-character codes, always starting with a number that represents one of 10 CCL categories, and I've outlined that on this slide. The second character of the ECCN is always a letter, and that is represented by one of those 5 product groups, which is also on this slide. Now I'm going to use the example of polygraph equipment that has an ECCN classification of 3A981. The polygraph equipment is found under category 3, which is electronics, and product group A, end items, equipment, accessories, attachments, parts, components, and systems. It's important to know if any of your products have ECCN classifications, because items with ECCNs may require an export license depending on the destination country. Now, there are 3 ways you can classify your products for export control purposes. First, you can do it yourself following the order of review. You start by determining which U.S. agency has jurisdiction over your products, and then, using the characteristics of your items, determining in which category they fall. BIS has published a free CCL order of review decision tree on their website that guides you step by step through the process of self-classifying your products. If you intend to self-classify, you should familiarize yourself with this tool, and I've provided a link on this slide. There's also software you can use to help classify your goods under ITAR and the EAR. So Shipping Solutions, for example, offers a product classification software that will help you navigate the process. But to use that software effectively, you still need to understand how the export control classification process works. Your second option for classifying your goods is to ask the manufacturer of the goods for the correct classification. Now, this only works if you're not the manufacturer and the manufacturer is willing to provide that to you. It's been my experience that that's not always been something they're willing to share, either because they don't export themselves and they don't know what their classification is, or they don't want to share that information with you. Your third option for classifying your products is to submit a commodity classification request through BIS's Simplified Network Application Process Redesign, also known as SNAP-R. SNAP-R is the same portal you will use if it turns out you need to apply for the export license. If you submit a CCATS request, as it's referred to, you need to include the model or part number of your item, the ECCN or ECCNs that you believe apply to your products, enough detail about the specification of your products for BIS to compare your products with the ECCN descriptions, sales literature for your items, plus enough technical detail so they can make an appropriate determination and justification that your items are subject to the Export Administration regulations and don't fall under the jurisdiction of the State Department or some other agency. And you can include up to 6 products in a single CCATS request. Now, keep in mind that not all items that are controlled by the Commerce Department have an ECCN classification. So if your products aren't in the U.S. munitions list and you can't find them on the Commerce Control List, they may be EAR 99, which means they are subject to the EAR, or Export Administration regulations, but they are not specifically described by an ECCN. Now, the tricky part with this determination is, of course, that you can't proactively determine your item is EAR 99 until you make the determination that it doesn't fit in any of the specified ECCN classifications. Like all aspects of the export compliance process, I recommend you always document how you came to this conclusion. If the Office of Export Enforcement or some other agency comes knocking at your door, you want to be able to demonstrate that your company has done its due diligence to do your best to comply. If your product is EAR, that doesn't mean there aren't any export restrictions. I hear from people all the time that they don't have to worry about export compliance because their items are all EAR 99. Keep in mind that there are other factors, such as the end use and end user of your item, that may require an export license, and I'll discuss that in just a little bit. So step number 2 in this process is to determine if you need an export license. As I mentioned earlier, if your item falls on the U.S. munitions list, you're going to need an export license from the State Department. But if they fall under the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department, only a relatively small percentage of U.S. exports and re-exports require a license. BIS license requirements are dependent on an item's technical characteristics, the destination, the end user, and the end use of the item. That's why we look through the Commerce Control List to see if your item fell under one of the ECCN. In this slide I showed you earlier, I mentioned that ECCN classification 3A981 applies to my polygraph equipment. Now this slide shows you the entry for that product under 3A981 that appears in the CCL. The second section of this entry, labeled License Requirements, tells me that the reason my product is controlled is for CC reasons, and that means crime control reasons. It also tells me that I should refer to CC column 1 in the Commerce Country Chart. This ECCN entry also tells me a lot more, like the fact that there are no license exceptions that are available, and there are other related controls under the ECCN classification OA982. An export license exception is an authorization that allows you to export or re-export items subject to the EAR that would otherwise require a license. There are several different license exceptions that exist, and they all have very specific conditions in which they can be used. Now, we could do a whole 1-hour webinar on export license exceptions, and perhaps we will at some point in the future, but I don't have time to talk about them today. But we do have a blog post that provides an overview of license exceptions called What You Need to Know About Export License Exceptions. And Kari, I'll ask you to post a link to that article in the chat for this webinar. The Bureau of Industry and Security hosts a 2-day seminar called Complying with U.S. Export Controls that walks through this export license determination process in much more detail, including a discussion of export license exceptions. It's very good. I've attended it several times. I just noticed in prep for this webinar that they're coming back to Minneapolis, where I live, and so I probably will be attending that when it comes back here again. So it's 2 days. Obviously, it provides a lot more detail that I can cover in just 1 hour. Now, if you're an exporter, you or someone else, or better yet, a whole group of you, should plan to go to this seminar. It's important. You'll find the current schedule at the bis.gov website, and then you can click on the Learn and Support link at the top of the page. Anyway, what we're concerned about at the moment is that my polygraph equipment is controlled for crime control reasons, and I need to check CC column 1. So here's a page of the Commerce Country Chart, and you'll see a list of countries in alphabetical order down the left-hand side of the page, and a list of reasons across the top. Obviously, this is just one page from a longer list, and it's listed from A to Z. Now, some of the reasons have multiple columns. So under the crime control, there is a CC1, CC2, and CC3. So let's say my potential customer for my polygraph equipment is in Honduras. I find Honduras on the left side of the page and slide over to the column labeled CC1. Remember, my 3A981 ECCN classification told me that the product was controlled under CC column 1. Now, if there is an X in the corresponding box, I need to apply for an export license. And in this case, for Honduras, there is an X. So I need to apply for a license because, as we learned in the AAR, there are no license exceptions available. Now remember, this is just one reason why a license may be required. As I mentioned before, there are software solutions that can help with this process. Here is a screenshot from Shipping Solutions export control software that tells me the same thing that I learned from the Commerce Country Chart by giving me a red light for export license requirements, meaning I need to apply for a license. It would be a green light if no license was required, or a yellow light if it was controlled, but there were license exceptions that were potentially available. If we run the same export control screening for my polygraph equipment, but for a potential customer in Cuba, you'll see I get a red light because I do need an export license, but also a red light because Cuba is an embargoed country. Part 746 of the Export Administration Regulations lists the countries that have been embargoed. The U.S. has placed general embargoes against Cuba, Iran, and Syria. The U.S. has placed sanctions on selected categories of goods to other countries like Iran and North Korea, and the U.S. has set sanctions on certain Russian and Belarus industries. You need to be aware of all of these. In addition to these country or industry sector sanctions, the U.S. has restricted exports to certain individuals, businesses, and other organizations that have been identified as engaging in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, known to be involved in terrorism or drug trafficking, or who have had their export privileges suspended. Not all these individuals, businesses, or organizations are foreign. They could actually be located in the U.S. The Commerce Department maintains the denied persons list, the unverified list, the entity list, and military end-user list, among others. The Treasury Department maintains the specially designated nationals list, the foreign sanctions evaders list, and the sectoral sanctions identifications list, among others. And the State Department has the non-proliferation sanctions and debarred lists. and other agencies have other miscellaneous lists. While there is no requirement that companies check every export against these various restricted party lists, it is a violation of export regulations to export to anyone on the U.S. lists. So even the smallest U.S. exporters should check all the parties in every export transaction against the various restricted party lists to prevent penalties. The U.S. International Trade Administration, or ITA, hosts the Consolidated Screening List, which allows you to screen against many of these lists for free. In addition, companies like Shipping Solutions offer paid subscriptions that provide more comprehensive screening services. The next step is to watch for red flags. As an exporter, you are responsible for knowing how your product is going to be used. Even products that seem harmless can sometimes be used in ways not intended. Some of these end uses are prohibited, while others may require an export license. For example, companies may not export to certain entities involved in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the missiles to deliver them without specific authorization, no matter what the items are. BIS publishes a list of red flags that may be indications that use of the product may be prohibited. For example, companies should be reasonably suspicious of orders for items that are inconsistent with the needs of the purchaser, a customer who declines installation and testing when it's included in the sales price or when normally requested, or requests for equipment configurations that are incompatible with the stated destination and could be violating U.S. export regulations. BIS cites the example of a South African businessman who tried ordering several dozen replacement switches for a medical imaging machine. In this case, it's normal to order one replacement switch. It's not normal to order several dozen at one time. It turns out these switches were going to be used as detonators for a nuclear bomb. A red flag may come up at any time in the export transaction. Could come early when you're filling out the requisite paperwork, or when you're finalizing your sales invoices. It's important to be vigilant and pay attention to all red flags all the time, from introductions to after the sale has been completed. If you encounter a red flag, you should refrain from the transaction until an export license application has been submitted to and issued by BIS. Now, don't ignore any red flags that you may encounter. This is what BIS calls self-blinding. Don't cut off the flow of information. Don't tell potential customers to stop discussing how they are going to use your products. Don't avoid other forms of communication that you normally receive. This is a case where ignorance is not bliss. Failing to know something you should have known can still get you in a lot of trouble. Step 5 in the export compliance process is to be aware of and understand deemed exports. Now, U.S. export restrictions outlined in the EAR don't just apply to products that are being shipped outside the country. Companies are exporting technology by sharing technical data, such as plans and blueprints of products, or by allowing a visual inspection of a product to foreign nationals within the U.S. This is called a deemed export and requires that companies follow the same steps we're discussing today, just as if they were physically shipping goods internationally. A foreign national is someone who is not a U.S. citizen, not a permanent resident, or not in the U.S. under specific refugee status. In a sense, the foreign person is considered to be the embodiment of his or her country of citizenship. The essence of the deemed export rule is that providing technology to a foreign person is the same as exporting it to that person's country of citizenship, regardless of where the parties are located when the technology is provided. So, for example, if I were to provide a Honduran citizen in Minneapolis with controlled technology for my polygraph equipment, that is considered to be an export of that technology to Honduras. And as we've discovered a little bit ago, that does require an export license. Step 6 in the process, is to document your compliance. What good is it to put all this effort into staying compliant if you can't prove that you've done so? When you classify your products, document when you do so and how you made the decisions you make. When you check to see if an export license is required, document the process. Keep copies of all the restricted party screenings that you do. As an exporter, you are required to maintain copies of all your export documents for a minimum of 5 years, although the Office of Foreign Assets Control has recently updated the document retention requirements for exports that fall under their regulations to 10 years. And even if you just need to keep your documents for 5 years, be aware that different agencies and departments start that clock ticking at different points. In addition to the standard export forms, you need to include any export control documents, memoranda, notes, correspondence, contracts, invitations to bid, books of account, finance records, restrictive trade practice or boycott requests, notifications from BIS, and any other documents pertaining to the transaction not specifically exempt from these record-keeping requirements. In case of an export compliance audit, you must be able to find all pertinent documents related to any export transaction from the last 5 to 10 years. The Office of Export Enforcement will not make an exception just because you've stored older files in a facility 300 miles away. In fact, doing so will only illustrate that you are ignoring best practices. When some businesses become aware of their legal obligations as an exporter, including this document retention requirement, they sometimes try to avoid these responsibilities by hiring a freight forwarder or another party to handle their exports. Now, there's nothing wrong with working with a freight forwarder or outsourcing your export functions to someone who has got more experience in that, but you have to keep in mind that while you can outsource responsibilities, you cannot outsource your liabilities. Companies that hire third parties to manage their exports should require documentation that all the export regulations are being followed, and they should retain copies of this documentation, as well as the actual export forms that must be generated for each shipment. This documentation can be used to demonstrate compliance with the EAR, or if some violations are found by the U.S. government, can be used as evidence of a good faith effort to comply, which could be a reduction in penalties, and it could reduce that substantially. Step 7 is to create an export compliance program. In this short time, and even with this high-level review of export compliance procedures, we've talked about a lot of different things that an exporter needs to know and a lot of different things to keep track of. I get asked, how are we supposed to do all this all the time? And that's where a written export compliance program comes into play. According to BIS, an ECP analyzes pieces of information and individual decisions and builds them into an organized, integrated system. It's a program that can be established to manage export-related decisions and transactions to ensure compliance with the EAR. Most exporters, most of us never plan on doing something wrong. However, mistakes sometimes happen, and the consequences of those mistakes can be significant. Companies can face fines, lose their export privileges, and in the most egregious cases, see people go to jail. A properly implemented ECP will help alleviate that risk. An ECP gives you a clear plan of how to audit your company's procedures and processes yourself, so you can identify and address any potential violations before they even surface. A well-written ECP can substantially reduce penalties if your company does violate export regulations, as long as you can document that you regularly followed your written ECP procedures. The BIS considers this a strong mitigating factor when determining penalties. Now, according to the BIS, an effective ECP includes 8 elements. Number 1 is a management commitment. You need the commitment from the very top that your company will comply with the regulations. 2, you need continuous risk assessment of the export program. 3, written export authorization procedures for determining jurisdiction, classification, licensing, and screening, all the stuff that we've talked about today. 4, clear record-keeping responsibilities. 5, ongoing training of all employees, including support staff who are involved in exporting. That's more important than ever with all the changes that are happening lately. 6, regular audits of the compliance program to ensure that it is being followed. 7, a program for handling compliance problems, including reporting export violations. And 8, scheduled reviews, maintenance, and updates of the written ECP as changes warrant. Some companies do it every 6 months or so, depending on how much exporting you do and how potentially dangerous it could be. It can be a lot of work to create an export compliance program, but as the old management saying goes, prior planning can prevent poor performance. So I'd like to finish my presentation with a quick overview of some of the potential export violations we discussed today and some suggestions for how you can prevent them. So the first potential violation is exporting controlled products without an export license. The solution's pretty easy. Number 1, you want to make sure you properly classify your products with the correct USML or ECCN classification to determine whether they are controlled, and then determine if the destination country requires an export license by checking the Commerce Country Chart. Violation number 2, exporting to an embargoed country without an export license. The solution is to check Part 746 of the EAR for the updated list of embargoed countries and determine if the destination country requires an export license by checking the Commerce Country Chart. Violation number 3, exporting to individuals, organizations, or companies on one or more of the U.S. government's bad guy lists. The solution's pretty straightforward. You should be screening all the parties in your export transactions against the government's various restricted party lists using the ITA's consolidated screening list or more comprehensive screening tools. Exporting a product that ends up in support of illegal activities, such as the spread of weapons of mass destruction, even if the product is not controlled and it was intended for non-military use. The solution is to watch for red flags. Know how your product is going to be used. Potential violation number 5, sharing controlled technologies with foreign nationals in the U.S. without a license, or what we call a deemed export. The solution to that is to identify the items and technologies that are controlled for export to specific countries, identify employees, interns, and visitors from those specific countries and restrict access to those items, and screen all foreign visitors and employees against the government's various bad guy lists. Now, I've covered a lot of ground today in a very short amount of time, and I want to provide you with some links to the various U.S. government agencies that I mentioned today and the starting point you can use to access their information. And if you go to the resources pages that we've created for this webinar and will make available after the webinar, you'll find links here as well. In addition, Shipping Solutions has more in-depth information on our website about many of the things I've talked about. Now, this presentation took a lot of information from 2 of the free white papers that we have available on our website that you can download. One is what you need to know about export compliance, and the other is how to determine if you need an export license. They're both very good, and if you haven't already, I'd suggest you download and review those, and they make great training materials for staff who aren't necessarily as familiar with the export process as you might be. Twice a week, we publish import-export related articles on Passages, our international trade blog, and you can go to shippingsolutions.com/blog to find an archive of nearly 900 blog posts, many of which deal with export compliance issues. Since we all have different learning styles, we also have a Shipping Solutions YouTube channel where we publish a lot of this same information in video format. So if you learn better by listening and watching rather than reading, check out our YouTube channel. And if you like it, please subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the broader the reach of that channel will be. So at this point, I will be happy to answer any questions that you have left in the 20 minutes or so that we have remaining. Kari is going to review your questions and ask them, and I'll do my best to answer them. So please go ahead, Kari. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we have a couple. If the sale has already been completed and I noticed a red flag afterward, what should be done then?
You should review it, and if it turns out you have if you've violated an export regulation, you should consider self-reporting to the appropriate government agency. I would say that you should involve legal counsel at that point in time and have that discussion with them on the best way to do that self-reporting. The regulations in the last few years have been changed to the point where self-reporting is a potential factor in reducing penalties to being changing the requirement that you self-report, and then if you don't, it's just another example of another violation. So it's more important than ever to self-report any violations if you discover them. So the potential red flag may or may not actually have resulted in a violation, and you certainly should review your export compliance program to incorporate that process for discovering a red flag that you discovered. But if you do discover a red flag, you do investigate, and you find a potential violation, you should consider self-reporting.
And then someone asked more about the seminar you talked about that you would attend in Minneapolis. Again, when is that happening and where is it taking place? Where can they register?
If you go to the BIS website, which the BIS website is in flux, they've reorganized it, and I'm going to guess that with the change of administration, there may be more reorganizations that go on. But if you go to bis.gov, G-O-V, at the top of the page is training and learning or something. I don't remember now what the link is. But if you hover over that menu choice, one of the options is going to be training. If you click on that, it's got a list. I think it had 6 upcoming BIS 2-day webinars that I mentioned, or seminars, that are coming up. The last of which is in Minneapolis, but there's also one in Houston and one in California, other locations as well. I don't remember them all, but go to the website. That's always the best place to get that latest information, and I recommend that you go.
And someone had a question about ECCNs and finding out that your item is actually EAR 99. So they're wondering about the supporting documentation on how you found your export item not to be found, not to have an ECCN, and is EAR 99, but you need the supporting documentation.
Well,
does it come from BIS as a legal document?
I mean, there are products that it's very clearly that an item is not potentially controlled and has an ECCN. So for those items, I don't think you need to have documentation per se. But if an item is, if you look at the ECCNs, some of them have very detailed specifications on what that particular item can do, and the documentation I would include is if the item that you have is close to the item that does have an ECCN, but it does not fall under that particular item because the specification falls outside that range. If it's smaller than it says it's small, then it has to be. If it's less powerful than the ECCN description says it has to be, I would document that, you looked at this ECCN and because of these specific reasons, you did not choose it. there's no official form where you have to do that. It would be something you'd put in an email or a memo or some other place where you document that you have it and keep that on file.
Can you speak briefly about export compliance when it comes to selling digital products that don't need to be shipped but can be accessed and downloaded from the internet? We have a good article about this on our blog.
Yeah. Again, if an item it includes technology or oftentimes just software, it's a high level of encryption that might cause a problem, then you need to be careful about who can access and download it. And you may need to have restrictions on certain IP addresses or IP countries who can access it. So it's trickier, but it's not an issue that's unique to your company. There are companies that have servers that are used to do this that have arrangements set up to provide controls. So I can't give you a specific answer to that other than look at the article that Kari, I think, is probably going to put in the chat and read through that. And then I would talk to your IP service provider and or internet service provider and make sure that those controls are in place.
A couple of restricted party screening questions. If there's a hit on the consolidated screening list, what's the best way to figure out if that party is the same as my foreign customer? My screening system doesn't always have good addresses, etc.
Well, one way is to go to the original documentation if that put the person or organization on that specific list. Depending on which list it is, it may have been published in the Federal Register. OFAC publishes the Office of Foreign Asset Control at the Treasury Department publishes a list, and they have some documentation. It may require to reach out to your potential client and get more information from them. Ultimately, if you have questions, you may want to reach out directly to the agency, which is controlling that list, and ask them for assistance and get some advice from them.
How about if a customer is listed on TIP list? Can you ship to them, or do you need a license from BIS?
I don't remember what the TIP list is. Can someone remind me what that would be?
And then another person asked, do these export controls and penalties apply to other countries and companies outside of the US?
Well, it depends. If a company is not located in the United States and has no legal presence in the United States, the U.S. regulations and controls may not apply, other than if it's a product that was created in the United States or includes parts or it uses technology that was developed in the United States. And in that case, then the U.S. export regulations may apply to those products, even if they're being manufactured in another country and never touching U.S. soil. So they may apply. The U.S. has broadened its reach to try to cover more products. So it depends on where the technology originates. It depends on where the goods were manufactured or the parts that were used in that goods, if any of those were from the United States. It may apply. Some of the regulations, like the financial regulations, the OFAC regulations, it may depend on how money is being transferred and things like that. So maybe it does apply. But other countries also have their own export control regulations as well. And so you should be aware of those. They publish their own lists. One advantage of software like the Shipping Solutions restricted party screening software is that we check not only the U.S. list, but also lists from more than 100 other lists published by other countries as well. So.
And that previous list, the TIP is the Trade Integrity Project list, which I believe was just added to the restricted party screening.
I don't remember enough about it to give you a good answer for that. But if you send me an email, I will give you. I will refresh my memory and reply to you. daven@shipsolutions.com. If I'm not answering any of your questions, or you're not thinking I'm giving you a very good answer to your question, or if you think of a question later, please don't hesitate to email me at daven@shipsolutions.com, or simply reply to my follow-up email. So when I send you the link with the link to the recording of this webinar, it comes from me. So you can just hit reply and you can respond and ask your questions that way too.
See, our client has a letter of credit and the financial institution is requesting supporting documentation that our item, dredge, is EAR 99. I've submitted to BIS awaiting their finding, but still not sure if BIS will supply me with a legal document that I can supply to a bank to appease their requirement. How do you suggest I would proceed with the documentation?
Well, BIS will provide you with their determination. So I've never worked with a bank on this in this regard, but I would guess that would be sufficient documentation if it's coming from BIS.
And then someone said, you touched on this a little bit already, but what do you recommend saving and writing to prove that something is EAR 99?
Again, there are categories of products. There are certain types of products that, unless they are manufactured specifically for military purposes, are simply going to be exempt. Simple screws, nuts, bolts, things like that are not going to are going to be EAR 99. So if they're obviously not applicable, then I don't know that you need to specific documentation for that. Other than you may want to just keep track of what the specifications are, have a spec list for all your products that you produce or export. It's more if you're exporting something that could potentially have an ECCN classification, but as I mentioned, the specification is such that it doesn't fall under the specific outlines of what the ECCN is. I would make sure to point out how it differs from the ECCN classification. And also there are, having your, so BIS, if you go to this 2-day webinar or seminar that BIS puts on, at least in the past they've done this, they've had someone from the Office of Export Enforcement speak, and they'll give examples of all the violations that they found, and people will make a claim that an item that they're selling is not a dual use item, that has no military application. And then the officer will simply go to that company's website, and on the very front page of their website, they have pictures of fighter jets on it, and they're obviously marking their products to military. So one thing maybe you want to keep is your sales literature and things like that, if it shows that your items are specifically created for commercial purposes.
Let's see, maybe another one or two have, if a block is due to another country's regulations, do we as a US company continue doing business with them?
That's a determination that you need to make. I mean, if you don't have a jurisdiction, if you're not doing business in that country that has that restricted party screening hit, and you're not concerned, you don't fall under their jurisdiction, it could very well be the case that you make the decision that you're not going to abide by that hit. That would not be unusual.
Yeah, I think we got to most of the questions.
Okay.
Like you said, anyone can email if they have any that we missed.
Right. Yeah. Please do. Please reach out. Please keep an eye on our website. I'm sorry.
Sorry, had trouble copying some of the links from the chat, so we'll send a number of those out in a follow-up email either later today or tomorrow.
Okay, great. So that'll come out, and like I said, that comes from my real email address. So if you have a follow-up question that I didn't answer, please go ahead and ask that question in that email, and I'll do my best to answer, or at least point you in the direction of someone who can provide an answer to your question. Otherwise, my email address is daven@shipsolutions.com, and you can send me an email that way. As I mentioned, we have a resources page. If you use your phone and scan that QR code, or there's the address listed on the slide as well. We have information that we discussed today on that web page, as well as a list of upcoming events and a spot where you can sign up for our Passages Premium newsletter that we send out most Tuesdays and Thursdays. So please check that out. So thank you all for joining me today. Thank you, Kari, for your help, and stay well, everyone.